The wind came off the Mediterranean before sunrise, cold and salt-edged, sweeping across the coastal plain of the Levant like a blade drawn flat against the earth. It bent the dry grass westward. It carried the smell of smoke, not the clean smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, oily black smoke of burning villages, of granaries set alight, of a civilization being peeled back layer by layer from the land it had claimed. November 25th, 1177. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon, but the sky to the east was already turning the colour of a bruise, deep purple, fading to a sickly copper, the kind of sky that old soldiers read like a letter from God. And what this particular sky seemed to say was not comforting. Somewhere to the south, spreading across the plain between Ramla and the sea, moved the largest military force the Kingdom of Jerusalem had faced in a generation. 26,000 men. Some chronicles say more. Cavalry in iron-scaled armour, light horsemen from the Syrian steppes, archers who could put an arrow through chainmail at 100 yards, veterans of a dozen campaigns under a commander who had never, not once, suffered a defeat that truly mattered. Their supply train stretched so far back toward the horizon that the rearguard could not see the vanguard. Their cooking fires the night before had lit the plain like a city. Their horses were everywhere, watering at streams, grazing on what little grass remained. Their riders loose and confident, their weapons stacked against saddles, while their owners foraged, slept, ate, or simply waited for Jerusalem to fall. Like a jeweled serpent uncoiling across the sand, Saladin's army moved north with the slow, absolute confidence of something that knows it cannot be stopped. And facing them, if facing is even the right word for what was about to happen, was a force that no reasonable military mind would have described as an army at all. Fewer than 500 knights. Perhaps 3,000 infantry scraped together from the dregs of a kingdom that had sent its best soldiers north chasing a fool's errand. A Grand Master whose order had spent the last 3 days cutting their way out of a siege. A nobleman fresh from 16 years in an enemy dungeon. And at the head of all of it, the thing that made every Muslim scout who reported back to Saladin struggle to keep the dismissal out of his voice. A 16-year-old boy. A 16-year-old boy whose hands were wrapped in white linen because the disease eating his body had progressed far enough that bare skin could no longer grip a sword. A boy whose face, already touched by the disfigurement that would eventually consume it entirely, looked nothing like the warrior kings of legend. A boy who had been told, repeatedly, by men who loved him and men who feared him and men who simply wanted to survive, that the rational, the responsible, the sane thing to do was to stay behind the walls of Ascalon and pray. He had heard them out. He had listened to every argument. And then he had called for his horse. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. This was not a battle where numbers were close. This was not a battle where clever terrain negated the disparity. This was not a battle where one side had a secret weapon, a technological advantage, a hidden reserve waiting in the hills. On paper, on any paper, in any language, reviewed by any general in any era, this was not a battle at all. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Saladin had enough men to simply swallow Baldwin's force whole, digest it, and continue marching without breaking stride. His commanders knew it. His soldiers knew it. Saladin himself, riding north with his eyes already fixed on Jerusalem's walls, knew it. But paper does not fight. Numbers do not fight. And sometimes, not often, not predictably, not in any way that makes the universe feel fair, or rational, or safe. Sometimes the thing that fights is the thing that simply refuses to accept what the numbers say. What happened at Montgisard on the feast day of St. Catherine in the year of our Lord 1177 did not just change the fate of a single battle. It cracked the aura of invincibility that had been building around the most dangerous military mind in the medieval Islamic world. It bought a dying kingdom 10 more years of breath. It demonstrated, in the most violent possible terms, that the distance between annihilation and triumph can sometimes be measured in nothing more than the will of one person to act when everyone else has already decided to surrender. This battle changed what the word impossible meant for everyone who was there to see it. To understand why Montgisard was so shocking, you have to understand just how thoroughly the Kingdom of Jerusalem had arranged itself for disaster in the months leading up to it. The kingdom in 1177 was a strange, fragile thing. A strip of coastline and hinterland carved out of the Levant by the First Crusade nearly 80 years earlier, sustained since then by a combination of religious fervour, military discipline, and the kind of desperate pragmatism that tends to develop in people who are permanently outnumbered and surrounded. At its greatest extent, it stretched from Beirut in the north to the edge of the Sinai in the south, with Jerusalem at its spiritual and political heart. A city sacred to 3 faiths and coveted with an intensity that made ordinary political ambition look modest by comparison. But the geography that gave the kingdom its spiritual significance also made it strategically nightmarish. It had coastline to the west and enemies on every other side. The Ayyubid Sultanate to the south in Egypt, the same Sultanate's Syrian territories to the north and east, and smaller but dangerous powers filling in the gaps between. For the kingdom to survive, it needed 2 things simultaneously: unity among its own feudal lords, and a reliable check on Saladin's ability to coordinate his Egyptian and Syrian forces into a single overwhelming thrust. In 1177, it had neither. Saladin had come to power in a way that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. After the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, the great Syrian strongman who had previously united the Muslim Near East against the Crusaders, Saladin had moved with extraordinary speed to fill the vacuum. He was nominally a vassal, technically a steward. In practice, he was a man who understood that power does not wait to be offered, it must be taken. And he had taken it with such skill and such apparent modesty that his rivals had scarcely noticed they were being absorbed until it was too late. By 1177, he controlled Egypt, had consolidated his grip on Syria, and was beginning to look at the Kingdom of Jerusalem with the patient, calculating attention of a man who has done everything else on his list and has arrived at last at the main event. Meanwhile, the kingdom had done something almost incomprehensibly self-destructive. Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders, had arrived in the Holy Land in 1177 with a substantial army, reinforcements from Europe, the kind of fresh troops that the kingdom desperately needed. There had been plans, real and serious plans, for a joint offensive with the Byzantine Empire against Egypt itself. A coordinated naval and land campaign that might, if executed well, strike Saladin at his base and reshape the entire strategic situation in the Levant. It was bold, it was possible, it might have worked. Philip wasn't interested. He had his own agenda, political manoeuvring around the question of who would marry Baldwin's sister Sibylla, dynastic games that mattered enormously to the Count of Flanders, and almost not at all to the survival of the kingdom.
So he took his army north. He took the Knights Hospitaller with him. He took most of the Templar Knights who were available. He pulled the cream of Jerusalem's military north, toward Harim, toward a siege that accomplished nothing, burning through men and resources that were needed elsewhere, while Saladin watched from Cairo and began to make different calculations. Because when the scouts brought Saladin the report, the Frankish army is in Syria, Jerusalem is stripped of its defenders, the leper king is practically alone, he did not waste time celebrating. He acted. By November 18th, his army was moving north out of Egypt, crossing the Sinai on established caravan routes that bypassed the coastal fortifications, and entering the Kingdom of Jerusalem's southern border near Darum and Gaza. He bypassed Darum, skirmished around Gaza, and pushed into the undefended plains with the easy confidence of a man walking into a house whose owner has left the door unlocked and the valuables on the table. Now, Saladin. You have heard of him. Everyone has heard of him. But here is the version of Saladin that matters for this story. Not the romantic figure of later legend, not the chivalric Muslim knight of Western imagination, but the specific military professional who stood on the Egyptian border in November 1177 and made a sequence of decisions that would haunt him for a decade. He was, at this point, a commander of genuine genius, patient where others were impulsive, disciplined where others were greedy. He had defeated enemies across 3 countries and never, not once, walked into a trap that he hadn't set himself. He had a specific gift for reading the vulnerability of an opponent and moving on it before the opponent could recover. He was, in almost every measurable way, the most dangerous man in the medieval Near East. And he was, on this particular November morning, absolutely certain he had nothing to worry about. He had heard about the boy king. Of course he had. Everyone had heard about Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper, the teenager, the tragic figure ruling a kingdom in decline from inside a body that was literally being destroyed beneath him. Saladin's intelligence was good. He knew about the disease, knew about the progressive paralysis, knew about the political chaos surrounding the succession question. And so when his scouts reported that Baldwin had ridden to Ascalon with fewer than 400 knights, Ascalon, the coastal fortress, where he was now effectively blockaded by the detachment Saladin had left to contain him, Saladin had made the decision that would define his career. He kept marching. He left an inadequate force to pin Baldwin down, and he turned his eyes north, toward the city that was the reason for everything, the city whose towers he could almost imagine he could see from the right hilltop on a clear day. Jerusalem was, he believed, essentially undefended. And he was right. He was almost completely right. Except for the boy on the horse in Ascalon, who was being told for the 3rd or 4th time that week that he could not possibly do what he was about to do. Baldwin IV had been diagnosed with leprosy when he was 9 years old by his tutor William of Tyre, who noticed during a childhood game that the boy couldn't feel pain in his right hand. Leprosy in the 12th century was not merely a disease, it was a sentence, social, spiritual, physical. Lepers were legally dead in some jurisdictions. They were required to carry bells to warn others of their presence. They were supposed to retreat from the world and wait for the world to forget them. Baldwin had been given a throne instead, which solved the forgetting problem, but not the dying one. By 1177, his right hand was functionally useless. His face was beginning to show the progressive disfigurement that would eventually render him unrecognizable. He could still ride, barely, using techniques he had learned from an Arab riding master, controlling his horse with his knees and thighs when his hands could not grip the reins reliably. He should have been in a sickbed. He should have been preparing his soul for what was coming.
He should have been doing anything other than what he was doing. What he was doing was reading the same reports Saladin was reading, but drawing exactly the opposite conclusion. Because while Saladin saw a helpless boy in a fortress, Baldwin saw something else. He saw an army stretched out over 40 miles of open plain. He saw supply lines spread thin. He saw horses that hadn't rested since Egypt. He saw soldiers who had been given permission to forage freely because their commander was sure no one would stop them. He saw a force that was, right now, at this specific moment, more vulnerable than it would ever be again. And he understood, with whatever combination of tactical instinct and reckless faith that makes certain people genuinely dangerous, that the moment was now. Not tomorrow, not when reinforcements arrived, not after he felt better or rested or received some sign from heaven. Now. But even for Baldwin, it was not simple. Because before the tactical calculation came the dread. And the dread was real. And it belonged not just to him, but to everyone in the kingdom who was watching what was happening to the land around them. Saladin's army had not come quietly. As it moved north through the coastal plain, it exercised the customary prerogatives of medieval warfare in enemy territory, which is to say, it burned and it killed and it took. Villages that had stood for generations went to ash in an afternoon. Olive groves that had been planted by grandfathers were cut to the root. Families who had tilled the same fields since before most of the army's soldiers had been born were given a single terrible choice: flee or be taken. Those who were taken didn't come back. They went south in chains toward the slave markets of Egypt, and the screaming that marked their passage echoed across the plain long after the army that caused it had moved on. The smoke from burning farmsteads stood against the sky in columns so numerous and so close together that from a distance they merged into a single black horizon, as though the earth itself had caught fire somewhere to the south, and the fire was moving north. In Jerusalem, the bells were ringing, not in celebration. In the city, women were moving their children into the lowest rooms of stone buildings. Priests were preparing the most sacred relics for concealment or flight. The patriarch was on his knees. Every person who could do arithmetic had already done it, had counted the men Baldwin had and the men Saladin had, and had reached the same conclusion. There was no version of this where the numbers worked out. There was no scenario in which 400 knights and a scatter of infantry stopped 26,000 veterans. The math was simply not there. And in the absence of math, people in Jerusalem in November 1177 were doing what people do when the math runs out. They were praying and waiting and trying not to think about what happened to cities when their walls came down. This was the world. This was the situation. This was the moment when a teenager with bandaged hands and a disease that was eating his face looked at the detachment blockading Ascalon, found the gap in their line, and gave the order to move. The land between Ascalon and Montgisard is not dramatic country. It does not announce itself. There are no towering cliffs, no narrow mountain passes, no single choke point where a small force can funnel a large one into a kill zone and count on the ground to do half the work. It is flat coastal plain, the kind of terrain that ancient armies crossed and modern roads follow. Wide open, with the sea to the west and low rolling hills to the east, and in between a broad expanse of sandy earth, broken by occasional ridges, dry riverbeds,
and the kind of scattered high ground that medieval commanders looked at the way chess players look at centre squares. Not decisive in themselves, but worth holding if you can. The mound known as Al-Safiya, Tel Es-Safi in Arabic, white and chalky, rising perhaps 30 feet above the surrounding plain, was exactly this kind of feature. Not a fortress, not a naturally defensible position in any strong sense, but high enough to see from, and high enough to anchor a flank. And in the flat coastal plain of the Levant, those 30 feet were worth thinking about. Baldwin's advisors had thought about them. The men around Baldwin in those final days before the battle, Reynald de Chatillon, Baldwin of Ibelin, his brother Baillia, were not fools. They were experienced soldiers who had spent their careers reading ground the way farmers read weather. And when the scouts brought back their reports about Saladin's dispositions, these men laid out what they saw with the clear-eyed brutality of people who cannot afford to be wrong. Saladin's baggage train was south of the main force. Parts of the army were still scattered across a radius of several miles. The cavalry, the Mamluk Ghulams, who formed Saladin's most dangerous striking arm, had been on the road from Egypt for weeks, and the horses were not in fighting condition. There was no coherent defensive perimeter, because no one had thought one was necessary. And if Baldwin moved now, moved fast, moved before any of that changed, if he came at the Ayyubid force from an unexpected direction while it was still dispersed and digesting its own confidence, then the open flat ground that should have favoured the larger force might, for one brief morning, favour the smaller one instead. Flat ground means room to charge. Room to charge means the Frankish heavy cavalry can do what it was built to do. And in the short, violent, decisive collision that heavy cavalry is designed to create, numbers matter less than they do in any other kind of fight. It was not a guaranteed plan, it was not even a good plan by conventional standards. It was the only plan available, and everyone around that map knew it. The force that Baldwin assembled for this gamble was small, specialised, and in some respects extraordinary. The core of it, the thing that gave the whole enterprise whatever military credibility it had, was the Knights Templar. Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master, had arrived from Gaza with 80 of his knights, having cut through or around the Ayyubid forces that had been blockading that fortress in a fighting withdrawal that must have been brutal and exhausting, and that no one seems to have recorded in adequate detail. 80 men. But they were Templar knights, which meant they were something quite specific. Professional warrior monks who had spent their adult lives in nothing but training and fighting, who operated under a military rule that emphasized absolute cohesion and obedience in combat, who charged in close formation at precisely the moment they were ordered to, and did not break that formation for any reason short of total destruction. They did not hesitate. They did not negotiate. They did not weigh personal survival against the mathematics of the charge. When the Grand Master gave the order, they went, and they went together, and the thing they created when they struck an unprepared enemy formation was something close to unstoppable. Behind the Templars came Baldwin's secular knights, the feudal cavalry of the kingdom. Fewer than 400 men, including the 60 or so who had ridden with Baldwin from Jerusalem. Among them were men whose names the chronicles preserved, and men whose names were not important enough to record. Reynald de Chatillon was here,
And if the Templars were the weapon's edge, Reynald was its fury. 16 years in an Ayyubid prison in Aleppo had not mellowed him. If anything, captivity had distilled him down to something pure and extremely dangerous. A man with no remaining patience for politics, no remaining tolerance for calculation, and an accumulated debt of rage that had been accruing interest for a decade and a half. He was officially Baldwin's second in command, the effective commander of the feudal forces, the man who would translate the king's orders into the actual physics of battle. He was also, even by the standards of the 12th century Levant, someone the word ruthless was inadequate to describe. Baldwin of Ibelin was here, and his brother Baillia, steadier men than Reynald, experienced and respected, the kind of lords whose presence in a force told the men around them that this was a serious undertaking, rather than a desperate improvisation. Reginald Grenier was here. Jocelyn III of Edessa was here. And commanding the few remaining available knights of the kingdom were men who had, in many cases, been woken in the night by the arrière-ban and told to ride immediately with whatever they could grab. The arrière-ban itself was Baldwin's act of institutional desperation and tactical genius combined. It was a royal proclamation, a general call to arms, obligating every able-bodied Christian man in the kingdom to report to the royal standard immediately. Not soldiers, not trained knights, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, grooms, stable hands, the men who fixed saddles and shoed horses and carried grain. All of them called up, handed whatever weapons could be found, and attached to the force as infantry. They were not professional soldiers. They were not trained for pitched battle. But they could hold ground. They could pursue a broken enemy. They could fill the gaps between cavalry formations and make a force of 500 armoured horsemen look to a confused enemy at a distance in the chaos of battle like something considerably larger and more organised. The burgesses of the coastal towns, Ascalon, Jaffa, streamed in as Baldwin's force moved north, swelling the infantry contingent to numbers that the chronicles estimate variously but consistently describe as several thousand. These men did not know what they were doing in a military sense, but they were following a king who was dying and refused to act like it. And that does something to people. Baldwin also took the true cross. This was not merely symbolic, although it was certainly that. The true cross was the holiest relic in the kingdom's possession, a fragment of the wood on which Christ had been crucified, housed in a gold reliquary and carried into battle by the Bishop of Bethlehem. Its presence at Montgisard was a theological statement and a psychological weapon simultaneously. To the knights riding alongside it, it was a promise. God is here. God has seen you choose this. God is watching what you do with it. To the enemy, when they saw it raised above the charging cavalry, it was something considerably less comfortable. A signal that these men were not fighting for land or glory or survival alone, but for something they believed, with total conviction, was worth dying for. Across the plain, Saladin's force looked different in almost every respect. 26,000, possibly more, organised around a corps of Mamluk Ghulams, the slave soldiers who formed the elite heavy cavalry of the Ayyubid military system. These were men raised from childhood specifically to fight, trained in horsemanship and archery from the age they could walk, organised into units with a cohesion and discipline that rivaled anything in the medieval world. Supplementing them were Turkoman mounted archers, fast, mobile, lethal at range, and substantial bodies of Arab and Syrian infantry, and auxiliary forces in numbers that the chroniclers disagree about and historians argue over, but which were, by any estimate, far in excess of what Baldwin had.
Saladin also had his nephew, Taqi ad-Din, commanding one of the wings, a capable officer who would fight effectively even in the chaos to come, and who would almost succeed in stabilizing what was about to go catastrophically wrong. But Saladin had a problem, and the problem was this: none of those 26,000 men were in position. The army that looked so overwhelming on a troop count was, in the days before Montgisard, not an army at all in the operational sense. It was a dispersed collection of units spread across 40 miles of coastal plain, each doing its own thing, because the commander had concluded there was nothing to worry about, and had let the normal discipline of campaign relax. Units were foraging, units were scouting ahead, units were managing the baggage train, which had become bogged down in soft ground somewhere south of the main advance. Horses were watered in small groups rather than kept saddled and bridled, because unsaddling a horse rests it faster, and the horses needed rest after the Egyptian crossing. The cavalry had been marching for weeks, and cavalry horses are not machines. They tire, they need days of rest and good feed before they can charge at combat effectiveness. And the horses of Saladin's force had had neither. There were officers who could have noted these vulnerabilities and ordered corrections. Perhaps some of them did. But the army was moving, the enemy was contained. Jerusalem was 2 days' march away, and the accumulated confidence of a force that has never been seriously challenged in its current campaign is a powerful force against prudent precaution. Saladin had decided the boy was not a threat, and in the calculus of military history, that decision cost him everything. The night before the battle, the dark was absolute. Baldwin's force had moved north from Ascalon along the coast, then swung east and south to intercept Saladin's line of march, a movement of roughly 50 miles executed in less than 24 hours, which meant that the men who were now lying on the cold ground in the dark had been marching or riding almost without pause since the day before. No fires, that was the order, and it held. No fires, no cooking, no light of any kind that might carry across the flat plain and announce to Saladin's scouts that something unexpected was moving toward them. The men ate cold food or nothing, wrapped themselves in whatever they had, and lay on the November ground while the Mediterranean wind moved over them and the stars wheeled overhead in the vast, indifferent dark. Among the Knights of the Order, the Templars prayed. That was their custom before battle, and they did it with the absolute quiet of men who had done it many times, kneeling in the dark in full armor, heads bowed, lips moving without sound. The prayer was not a petition for survival. The Templar rule did not encourage the belief that survival was the point. The prayer was a consignment, the deliberate act of placing themselves and their deaths, if death was what God required, into a framework larger than either. They had chosen this. They had chosen it when they took their vows, had been reminded of it every morning since, and the night before Montgisard was no different from any other night in that respect. They were ready. They were always ready. It was, in its strange way, restful. Not everyone in the camp had the Templars' austere relationship with dying. Farther back in the dark, where the infantry lay in a long, irregular mass of tired bodies and borrowed weapons, a man was checking and rechecking the buckle on a leather strap. He was, or had been until recently, a blacksmith from Ramla, a man whose professional relationship with iron was entirely commercial, who had shod horses, and repaired tools, and made hinges and nails, and had never in his life pointed a weapon at another human being with intent. The sword he was carrying had been given to him by a neighbour who had been given it by someone else. He didn't know if it was sharp enough. He didn't know what to do if he got separated from the men around him. He didn't know most things that a soldier is supposed to know. What he knew was that his city was gone. He had watched the smoke rise from its direction 2 days ago, and his family was somewhere to the north, and the army that had done those things was sleeping on the ground somewhere ahead of him in the dark, close enough that if the wind shifted, he thought he might be able to smell their fires. Reynaud de Chatillon did not sleep. He sat with his back against a stone and his sword across his knees and his eyes open. And if anyone had thought to ask him what he was thinking, he might not have had an answer they could use. 16 years is a long time to carry something. It changes the shape of it without making it lighter. And Baldwin. Baldwin lay on his back on the cold ground, because lying down was what his body required, the white linen wrappings on his hands pale in the starlight, staring up at the sky with eyes that were still clear and still sharp and still seeing everything they were supposed to see. The disease had taken a great deal from him already. It had taken the full use of his hands. It was taking his face. In the years ahead, it would take his sight and eventually his ability to stand. But it had not, on this night, taken the capacity to feel what he felt. The fear, yes, real and specific and honest. The fear of a young man facing long odds on cold ground, and alongside it, pushing against it, something else. Not certainty. Nothing so comfortable as certainty. Something harder and more useful than that. The absolute conviction that not trying was worse than trying and failing. That the version of himself who stayed in Ascalon and waited to be relieved was not a version he could live inside. That whatever happened tomorrow, it would not happen to a king who had hidden. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for long. But he slept. Morning came like a drawn sword. The sun was still below the horizon when the first Frankish scouts came back at a run, and what they reported changed the quality of everything. Saladin's army was there. Right there. Closer than Baldwin had dared hope, and in exactly the condition his advisers had prayed for. The main body was strung out across 3 miles of plain between Ramla and the low rise of Al-Safia, and it was not in order. Cooking fires were burning, horses were unsaddled, groups of soldiers moved in no particular formation between the scattered encampments, some foraging, some sleeping still, some gathered around fires with the loose, unhurried posture of men who expect nothing to happen before midday. The baggage train, carts, pack animals, supply wagons, was bogged down to the south, with several hundred soldiers still labouring to free it from the soft ground. There were no defensive lines. There were no prepared positions. There was no cavalry screen positioned to give early warning of approach. The scouts delivered their report in whispers. Baldwin listened. He did not speak immediately. He turned his head toward Reynaud, and Reynaud looked back at him, and in that exchange, a second less, the entire strategic calculation was completed. Then Baldwin raised his bandaged hand. Silence fell across the army like a physical thing. It was sudden and absolute. The silence of several thousand people simultaneously understanding that something was about to happen and that sound was now dangerous. The Templars stopped moving. The infantry stopped shifting on the cold ground. The horses felt it. Horses always do, and even they went still, ears forward, nostrils flared, reading the intention in the bodies of the men who rode them. The wind came off the sea and moved through the grass, and that was the only sound in the world for 10, full seconds. From the top of the ridge, in the grey pre-dawn light, you could see it. The fires of Saladin's camp scattered across the plain below, orange points against the dark ground. The shapes of men moving between them, small and unhurried. The dark mass of horses in their picket lines. The vast, relaxed, absolutely unsuspecting confidence of an army that is certain no one is coming. They were wrong. Baldwin looked at Odo de Saint-Amand. The Grand Master of the temple nodded once, the kind of nod that ends conversations, and turned back to his knights. The morning was early. The sun had not reached the horizon. There would never be a better moment than this one. The Templar horn sounded once. It was not a long call, not the extended ceremonial blasts that signalled formation changes or the complex sequences that carried tactical orders across a noisy battlefield. It was short, sharp, and cold. A single breath of sound that cut through the morning air and said one thing only: now. 80 Knights Templar put their spurs to their horses simultaneously. There is a reason that the charge of heavy cavalry in the medieval period was something that experienced soldiers feared in a way that went beyond ordinary military calculation. It was not simply the weight of horse and man in armour, although that was substantial, a war horse in full barding carrying an armoured knight representing somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds of moving iron. It was not simply the speed, although the speed was real, a heavy war horse at the gallop covering ground at 30 miles an hour, which, in the pre-dawn dark on flat ground, meant that the distance between the ridge and the sleeping encampments below disappeared in less time than it takes to register what you're seeing. It was the combination. It was the sound. The thunder of hooves that started as a distant rumble and became, in the span of seconds, a physical vibration in the chest of every man who heard it. A sound you didn't hear so much as feel in your sternum and your teeth and the backs of your hands. It was the sight of it, the wall of horses and steel coming out of the dark at speed. The morning light beginning to catch the edges of upraised lances and the visors of lowered helms. The thing resolving from shadow into shape in less time than your mind could fully process. And it was the smell of it. The enormous animal smell of horses in hard exertion. The hot breath, the churned earth, the iron and sweat, and the specific, unmistakable smell of large living things moving very fast in very close formation. A smell that worked on some ancient, pre-rational part of the brain that knew, before conscious thought could form, that something enormous and dangerous was right there. The soldiers in the Ayyubid camp heard it before they saw it. A man sitting by a fire with a cup of something warm in his hands turned his head at the sound, frowning, not understanding yet. A groom who had been cinching a saddle buckle stopped, his hands frozen. A soldier who had been asleep sat upright, wide-eyed, trying to interpret what was vibrating through the ground beneath his bedroll. And then the shapes resolved out of the pre-dawn dark. The first rank of Templar horses crossing the last 100 yards at full gallop, lances lowered, the knights behind their shields, the whole formation moving with the frightening cohesion of a thing that has trained for this moment every day for years. And the understanding arrived in the Ayyubid camp, not as a single thought, but as a wave, spreading outward from the point of first recognition in a radius of screaming. There was no organized defense. There could not have been. The time between the first horn and the first impact was perhaps 40 seconds. In 40 seconds, you can stand up. You can grab your sword. You cannot form a line. You cannot get your horse saddled. You cannot do anything that turns scattered individuals back into a fighting unit. The men in the path of the Templar charge did the only thing available to them. They tried to get out of the way. But they were not all in the path, and Saladin was not a man who stayed panicked for long. Alarms were spreading outward through the camp in concentric circles. Shouting, the crash of overturned equipment, horses screaming as they caught the urgency of the men around them. Officers were on their feet. Saladin himself, accounts vary on exactly where he was when the attack began, but they agree that he reacted quickly, was issuing orders within the first minutes, trying to pull coherence out of chaos. His nephew, Taqi ad-Din, began organizing the left wing, rallying the cavalry units that hadn't been hit in the initial impact, pulling them into some kind of formation on the flank of the Templar penetration. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, the real professional core of the force, began moving toward the sound of combat, slowly, because their horses were stiff and their equipment was not ready, but moving. The time was perhaps half an hour after first light. Montgisard was becoming a battle. Saladin formed his force as fast as any commander in the medieval world could have managed it. A centre, 2 wings. The classic arrangement, designed to absorb the initial shock and then envelop the attacker on both sides. Taqi ad-Din was on the left, fighting effectively, already beginning to push against the flank of the Templar advance. The right wing was slower to consolidate, units still arriving from their scattered positions, horses still being brought up. But it was forming, and in another 10 minutes it would be capable of meaningful action. But 10 minutes was time Baldwin did not intend to give him. The secular cavalry had followed the Templars in a second wave. Baldwin's knights, Reynald's knights, the men of Ibelin and the other lords, hundreds of armoured horsemen pouring down from the ridge in the wake of the Templar penetration, widening the breach, engaging the units that were trying to regroup on the flanks of the initial charge. And behind them, still coming, still moving, the infantry of the arrière-ban, streaming across the plain in irregular masses, the trained men in front with whatever discipline they had, the untrained men behind them with whatever courage they could find. All of it flowing forward into the gap that the cavalry had torn open. The battle had become a grinding, expanding chaos across 3 miles of flat ground. In the centre, where the Templars had first struck, the fighting was close and brutal. Cavalry milling against cavalry, men fighting from horseback with swords when lances had shattered or been dropped. The occasional man dragged down from his horse and killed on the ground by infantry who had caught up to the press. The smell of blood and horse sweat and churned earth was everywhere. The sound was overwhelming. Metal against metal, screaming horses, screaming men. The bark of orders in Arabic and French and Latin. The deep, rhythmic impact of massed horses hitting each other. A wall of noise so total that men shouted into each other's faces at arm's length and still could barely make out words. On the Ayyubid left wing, Taqi ad-Din was holding. His cavalry was better organized than anyone else in Saladin's force at this point, and he was fighting with the focused competence of a man who is trained for exactly this kind of crisis. But holding was not the same as winning, and the pressure against him, Baldwin's secular cavalry pressing from the front while the Templars drove deep into the centre, was constant and increasing. And then there was the matter of the man who rode to the middle of it. There are moments in battles, rare moments, moments that experienced soldiers who survive them talk about for the rest of their lives. When something happens that isn't tactical, something that operates below strategy, below calculation, below the rational machinery of military decision-making.
Something that goes straight to the part of human beings that is old and irrational, and responds not to orders, but to symbol. Baldwin IV rode into the centre of the battle. He had been moving with his knights, directing, watching, coordinating, doing what commanders do in the middle ground between the planning table and the killing floor. And then, at some point, accounts are imprecise about exactly when, but agree that it happened, he pushed forward. Through the press, toward the thickest part of the fighting, his horse moving through men on foot and men on horseback and the terrible debris of a collapsing battle line. His bandaged hands managing his reins with the Arab technique his riding master had given him. His face set, his body somehow upright and present and unambiguous on the back of that horse. He was not a ghost of himself. He was not dying. He was not suffering, or if he was suffering, it was behind his eyes and invisible. What the men around him saw was a king. Young, yes. Sick, yes. Plainly human, yes. But present and moving and choosing the centre of the worst place to be. That is the thing that cannot be manufactured and cannot be faked. The choice. Everyone on that battlefield knew who Baldwin IV was, what he was facing, what his body was doing to him. And he had chosen this, and he was here. And the Tangza was above him, gold in the morning light. The sound that came from the Frankish line was not a cheer in the conventional sense. It was something more involuntary than that, a roar that came from the chest rather than the throat, from something below conscious decision, the sound of men who have just been shown a reason that is larger than their fear. They surged forward, not as a plan, not as an ordered advance, as a release, a wave of energy that had been held in by cold ground and dark hours and too many reasons to doubt, and was now released all at once. Saladin's centre, which had been wavering, broke. It did not break slowly. It did not peel back in the orderly fashion of a retreat that preserves unit integrity and allows reorganization at a safe distance. It broke the way a dam breaks, all at once, catastrophically, the collapse spreading faster than any order could chase it. Units that had been fighting with reasonable discipline dissolved in minutes as the men next to them ran. Soldiers who had never considered breaking suddenly found that everyone around them was running, and the calculation that kept a man fighting, I am not alone, I am part of something, the formation will hold, simply ceased to apply. The baggage train to the south, which had been mired in soft ground and represented both the supplies and the confidence of the entire expedition, was suddenly accessible to Frankish cavalry. The screaming that had started in the camp 2 hours ago had never really stopped, but now it changed register. Less the alarm of surprise, more the pure animal sound of a force that has stopped believing in itself. Saladin knew it was over before the order could reach his commanders. He had seen battles turn before, but he had been on the winning side of those turns. He had never been here, on this side of this particular moment, watching 26,000 men come apart around him, while a force a fraction of their size pushed through the gap, with the terrible momentum of something that has been given every reason in the world to fail and has decided not to. He did not stay to watch it finish. Saladin escaped on a racing camel. That detail, preserved in the chronicles, noted by Muslim historians with the particular care of people recording something significant, says everything about how complete the collapse was. A racing camel is not a commander's mount. It is not dignified. It is fast and ugly, and it makes no concessions to the prestige of the man on its back. And the fact that Saladin was on one rather than a horse tells you that there was no time for anything else. The alternative to the racing camel was capture or death, and his bodyguard fought with controlled desperation, not to win, but to extract their commander from a situation that winning was no longer part of. He went south, he went fast, he did not look back, or if he did, what he saw was not something that offered any comfort. Because what was behind him was the remnant of an army that had been, an hour before, the most dangerous military force in the Near East, now dissolving into the flat ground of the coastal plain in every direction available. Taqi ad-Din's left wing held longest. His cavalry fought with genuine discipline, covering the withdrawal of what units they could reach, taking losses but not breaking. The kind of fighting retreat that requires both skill and nerve in roughly equal measure. Ahmed, his son, died in this fighting. The detail was recorded by the chroniclers as a measure of how serious the combat was at that point. Not a rout, not a massacre, but a real battle, fought by real soldiers, trying to hold something together while everything around them failed. They held it together long enough to matter, and not long enough to change the outcome. The pursuit was brutal in the way that medieval pursuits were always brutal, which is to say, relentlessly and without mercy. Because the rules of medieval warfare did not require mercy toward a broken enemy in flight, and the men doing the chasing had spent too long being afraid of this army to extend any. Baldwin's cavalry spread out across the plain, running down individual riders and small groups, covering ground that the accounts describe as 12 miles from the battle site. The plain behind the retreating Ayyubids was marked by the things that armies drop when they stop being armies and become individuals trying to survive. Weapons, armour, equipment, the supplies from the baggage train that was now in Frankish hands. Banners that had flown over the pride of Saladin's expedition, now lying in the churned November mud. Ahmad's body was found here, somewhere in the field south of Al-Safia. The jurist Dia ad-Din Isa, a scholar who had apparently been accompanying the army, was captured, his presence suggesting both how confident Saladin had been about this being a routine campaign and how completely unroutine it had become. The Frankish infantry, the arrière-ban-men, the blacksmith from Ramla and the hundreds like him, filled the ground that the cavalry had abandoned in pursuit. They moved through the debris of the collapsed Ayyubid force. Some of them had never been in a battle before today. Some of them would never be in a battle again. What they found on the plain of Montgisard was something that most of them had not allowed themselves to imagine when they marched out of their towns and villages 2 days before. They had won. The army that had burned their farms was running south as fast as it could move. The fields ahead of them, stripped, scarred, smelling of smoke and trampled grain, were no longer under threat. The thing that had seemed like the end of the world, the dark horizon of smoke that had filled the sky for a week, was retreating. By the time the sun had crossed its zenith and begun its descent toward the sea, the plain of Montgisard was quiet. The fighting was over. The pursuing cavalry was still out there somewhere to the south, but here, on the ground where the battle had been, there was nothing left to fight. The wind came back. The grass moved. The Mediterranean light fell flat and clean across the churned earth and the scattered debris of the engagement. And in the silence after the noise, in the pause after the impossible thing had actually happened, men who had been swinging swords an hour ago stood still,
and tried to understand what they had just done. What they had done was this. With fewer than 500 knights and a few thousand untrained infantry, a dying 16-year-old king had broken an army of 26,000 men, scattered it across 40 miles of coastal plain, and sent its commander, the most feared military figure in the Islamic world, riding south on a camel in humiliation toward a Cairo that did not yet know what had happened to its invincible sultan. The numbers, when they were eventually counted and recorded, were staggering. Saladin reached Cairo on December 8th, 13 days after the battle. He had left with an army estimated at 26,000. He arrived with approximately 1/10 of that number. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered into the desert in ones and twos, men who had simply kept running south and either made it back to Egypt weeks later in ones and twos, or didn't make it back at all. The mathematics of the casualty count tell the story more brutally than any narrative. This was not a defeat. It was not a reverse. It was an annihilation. The destruction of a major expeditionary force in a single afternoon by an enemy that had no business destroying it. Roger de Moulin, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, was not present at Montgisard. He was in the north with Philip of Alsace's useless expedition, but he received the reports afterward and compiled figures that survive. 1,100 Frankish dead, 750 wounded. Those numbers are significant. They are the losses of a force that was heavily engaged, not the peripheral casualties of a one-sided slaughter from a position of safety. Baldwin's army had been in the fight, had been hurt by it, had paid a real price, which makes the outcome not a lucky accident, but a genuine military victory achieved through sustained, costly combat. The specific fates of the commanders were a study in the strange arithmetic of medieval warfare. Saladin survived, which was the most important fact from his perspective, and the most consequential from everyone else's. His bodyguard had done its job. The racing camel had done its job. He was alive, humiliated, and already, even in the immediate aftermath of the most complete defeat of his career, thinking about what came next. Taqi ad-Din survived as well, his left wing having held its discipline long enough to extract the bulk of its force intact. His son Ahmad did not survive, and that loss was personal in a way that military defeats alone are not. A grief that the chronicles record briefly, but that must have been present in Saladin's tent for a long time afterward. The jurist Dia ad-Din Isa, captured on the battlefield, became a prisoner of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. What happened to him subsequently, the chronicles do not record in detail, but his capture was noted as symbolically significant. A man of learning and religious authority, taken because he had been confident enough in his sultan's army to accompany it on what was supposed to be a routine campaign. Odo de Saint-Amand, the Templar Grand Master who had led the charge that opened the battle, survived Montgisard. He would survive for 2 more years of warfare. But in 1179, at the Battle of Marj Ayyun, he was captured by Saladin's forces. He refused to be ransomed. The Templar rule forbade it, holding that no ransom should be paid for a captured knight, and died in an Ayyubid prison, the kind of ending that fit the hard edges of the life he had lived. Reynald de Chatillon rode back from the pursuit with the same expression he had carried into it. Not triumph exactly, but something darker and more personal. A settling of accounts that could never be fully settled. He would remain one of the most volatile and dangerous figures in the kingdom's politics for the next decade.
a man whose hatred of Saladin was so pure and so specific that it shaped the strategic landscape around him. His story would end at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when Saladin, having finally achieved what Montgisard had denied him, personally executed him. But that was 10 years away, and on this November evening, Reynald de Chatillon was alive, and the enemy was running. Baldwin IV was carried back toward his lines when the fighting was done. The precise physical condition he was in by the end of the battle has been recorded only vaguely. The sources agree that he was exhausted, that his disease had not been stayed by the excitement of combat, and that he required assistance. But he was alive. He was conscious. He was the king who had just broken Saladin. Now look at the battlefield itself. The plain between Ramla and the sea had been transformed in the space of a single morning into something that looked nothing like what it had been before dawn. The orderly fires and organized encampments of Saladin's army were gone. What remained was the aftermath of collapse, visible across miles of ground in every direction. Overturned supply carts, the sprawled forms of horses that had fallen and not risen, equipment dropped in flight, swords, shields, bows, quivers of arrows, armor pieces abandoned because they slowed a man who was trying to run, scattered across the plain in the irregular pattern that fleeing armies leave. Densest near where the fighting had been fiercest, thinning out as you moved south along the line of pursuit. Banners that had flown over Saladin's columns lay in the mud. The baggage train, freed from its soft ground trap by the soldiers who had been labouring over it when the battle began, and then abandoned in the flight, sat tilted and broken and silent. Its contents, food, supplies, the accumulated logistics of a major campaign, scattered around it. The wind moved across all of it with complete indifference. Near the mound of Al-Safia, where some of the heaviest fighting had occurred, the ground was marked in the way that medieval battlefields were always marked, the specific, irrevocable marks of close-quarters violence carried out at scale. Men from both sides lay there, the dead of a kingdom and the dead of a sultanate, side by side on the same indifferent earth, in the same November light, equally still. In Jerusalem, when the news arrived, the sound that rose from the city was something between a cheer and a prayer. The release of a people who had been certain they were about to die, and now, against everything the mathematics had promised them, were not. The patriarch came out of the cathedral. The priests rang every bell. Women who had been hiding their children brought them out into the streets. There was weeping that was not grief. There was laughter that was not quite joy, but something more extreme than either. The city that had been preparing itself for siege was instead receiving the messenger of an impossible victory, and the man on the horse who brought the news could not get a sentence out before the crowd around him drowned it in noise. In Cairo, there was silence of a very different kind. Saladin arrived in his capital on December 8th, 13 days of flight and retreat that had passed through the Sinai, that had been accompanied by the gradual, terrible accumulation of understanding about what had happened. The reports had come in piece by piece during those days. This unit had not returned. That commander was missing. The baggage train was lost. The jurist was captured. The camp was in Frankish hands. Each piece had added to the picture, and by the time he reached Cairo, the picture was complete and unambiguous, and there was nothing to do with it except sit with it. He did not hold court for several days. He did not receive the normal stream of petitioners and advisers. He sat and he thought, and he began, because he was who he was, to think about what came next. The Muslim historians who recorded Montgisard in its immediate aftermath used language that does not appear in their accounts of Saladin's other campaigns. Words like calamity. Words that suggested not just a military setback, but a moral reckoning. The unsettling of a confidence that had been total. The discovery that the universe did not guarantee the outcomes that the mathematics had promised. Some of them, reaching for a framework that could hold what had happened, concluded that the defeat was so severe, so complete, so contrary to every reasonable expectation, that it could only be understood as something ordained by forces outside human calculation. They were not wrong to reach for that framework. Sometimes the facts require it. What Montgisard bought was time, not safety, not resolution, not the turn of the war toward a conclusion. Time, that most precious and most finite of military currencies, the thing that armies die for, not because time itself wins battles, but because time is what allows the living to try again. The immediate strategic consequences rippled outward in ways that Saladin had not intended and could not immediately reverse. His Syrian vassals, the lords whose territories bordered the Crusader states to the north, had been expecting relief that never came. Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch were still pressing the siege of Harim, and without Saladin's Egyptian army to threaten their rear, they could maintain it through 1178 without fear. The delicate balancing act that Saladin had been performing, holding his Egyptian and Syrian holdings together against both Crusader pressure and internal dissent, was made significantly harder by the sudden subtraction of 26,000 men and the credibility that had been attached to them. He had lost not just soldiers, he had lost the assumption of invincibility. And that assumption, once lost, is never fully recovered, because the people whose cooperation you need have seen it fail, and will file that information away in the back of their minds forever. Baldwin IV took his victory and built something with it. Not more victories. The kingdom was too exhausted for another offensive, and his body was entering the more advanced stages of its deterioration. He built a monastery. On the field of Montgisard, on the anniversary of the battle that fell on the feast day of St. Catherine of Alexandria, he established a Benedictine house dedicated to her memory. It was a small thing in material terms, but it was a permanent thing. Stone on the ground where the battle had been. A physical insistence that what happened here would not be forgotten. That the ground itself was marked and consecrated and different from what it had been before. It stood for decades. It was Baldwin's way of signing his name to the day. Saladin learned. This is the thing about genuine intelligence in a commander. It accepts information that is painful, processes it accurately, and changes behavior accordingly. He had made 3 specific mistakes at Montgisard. He had allowed his army to disperse. He had underestimated his opponent, and he had moved with speed and confidence without the discipline to maintain his force in fighting condition during that movement. He would not make those mistakes again. The Saladin who met the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 was a different commander from the one who rode north from Egypt in November 1177. Not in his fundamental character, but in his operational method. At Hattin, he chose his ground with obsessive care. He cut the Frankish army off from water. He used patience as a weapon, letting the desert do work that swords would not have to. He won a victory so complete and so systematic that it made Montgisard look like what it was, a lesson that an exceptional student had learned and applied. 10 years later, with devastating effect. But 10 years is 10 years. The kingdom of Jerusalem that fell at Hattin in 1187 was not the same as the one that would have fallen at Jerusalem in 1177. The decade that Montgisard purchased was not nothing. It contained lives. It contained the reign of a king, flawed, diminished, progressively destroyed by his own body, who governed his kingdom with a competence and a care that none of his successors could match. Baldwin IV ruled from a cot when he could no longer ride. He ruled blind in the final years, directing military operations and political negotiations through others, when his body had taken everything except his mind. The man who had ridden into the centre of the battle at Montgisard with bandaged hands died in 1185, at 24, having never stopped being a king for a single day of the disease that consumed him. He did not leave an heir. He had always known he would not. He left something harder to quantify and more durable than that. A demonstration enacted in blood and sweat on a flat coastal plain in November that the circumstances into which you are born do not determine the choices you make inside them. This is the thing about Montgisard that does not appear in the casualty counts or the campaign maps or the strategic analyses. The numbers tell you what happened. They do not tell you what it meant. And what it meant, what it has continued to mean, to every person who has encountered the story in the 9 centuries since it occurred, is something that resists the tidy categories of military history. It is not simply an upset. It is not simply a demonstration that mobility and surprise can compensate for numbers. It is the story of a person who had been given by his own body, by the political circumstances of his kingdom, by the mathematical reality of the forces arrayed against him, every conceivable reason to accept the verdict that had already been written, and who had looked at that verdict and decided to contest it. The historians and chroniclers who wrote about Montgisard, both Christian and Muslim, reached for language of the miraculous, because the ordinary language of military analysis did not quite fit what they were trying to describe. But the miracle, if there was one, was not supernatural. It was entirely human. It was the miracle of a choice made in full knowledge of the odds, by a person who understood the odds and chose anyway, in the pre-dawn dark, on cold ground, with bandaged hands and a body that was destroying itself from the inside out. Centuries later, the plain of Montgisard is unremarkable. The Mediterranean wind still comes off the sea. The grass still bends westward. Tel es Safi, white and chalky, 30 feet above the surrounding ground, still rises from the flat plain near modern-day Israel, and you can stand on it on a November morning and see the same horizon that the scouts saw in 1177, the same flat expanse of coastal ground stretching south toward Ascalon, north toward Ramla, east toward the hills. There is no monument. There is no battlefield preservation. The ground that was consecrated with stone and prayer by a dying king has been returned to the earth, absorbed back into the landscape, indistinguishable now from the fields and roads around it. People drive past it on their way to somewhere else, and most of them don't know what happened there, and the wind doesn't tell them. But the story remains. It remains because it is the kind of story that human beings need. Not for comfort exactly, and not for easy lessons about courage and faith and the triumph of the righteous. Because history does not deal in those lessons reliably, and Montgisard certainly does not. It remains because it is true, because it happened. Because on a specific morning in a specific November, on a specific piece of flat ground by the sea, a boy who was dying made a decision that changed what happened next, and the world, however briefly, however contingently, however much the long arc of the war would eventually bend back toward Saladin, was different because of it. The Benedictine monastery is gone. The baggage train has been dust for 800 years. The lances are splinters, the armour is rust, the horses are long since returned to earth. Saladin's racing camel has been forgotten by history along with its name. Ahmad, Taqi ad-Din's son, has no grave that anyone can visit. The blacksmith from Ramla, whose name no one thought to write down, is somewhere in the ground of the coastal plain, unmarked and unremarkable, part of the land he thought he was defending. And Baldwin IV, the leper king who was supposed to be dying too fast to do anything important, he did the thing that cannot be taken back, the thing that time cannot undo. He rode out, he found the moment, he struck. A boy in the last years of his life, and he chose to spend them this way.